Well, good morning if you are in sunny Southern California, let's say Beverly Hills, Hollywood, Studio City, Melrose, you pick the place, Long Beach, Venice Beach, Malibu. Good afternoon if you are in New York City, where I am. Guten Abend if you are in Berlin, where they're having all kinds of tech problems tonight. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio. That makes me Fred Plotkin. Adagio is the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. And those of you who have followed me for the past 2 years, and today is the second anniversary of this show, I wanted a very special guest. You know that my original intention was, number one, to get people who have been locked in during the pandemic, but number two, to find people who inspire me and always have, whether I know them very well, whether I know them casually, whether I know them not at all. And one of the most inspiring people I know, although I've seldom been with him in the same space, is Matt Tyrnauer. Matt Tyrnauer joins us from somewhere in Southern California, an undisclosed location. And Matt, I met as a journalist. Matt is an outstanding journalist, reporter, analyst. He sees things behind the news, within the news. He makes connections that average journalists don't make. And he shows us, I don't want to call it, I'll use an Italian word, the dietrologia. Dietro in Italian means behind. So it would, not as in where I'm sitting, but behind as in unseen, hidden. And behind what we see is what we don't see, which is a very Italian concept, even though Matteo Tyrnauer is not Italian. He and I also share a love and fascination with the Italian way of looking at the world. So that informs his journalism, which has been outstanding in print. And then he became a fantastic documentary filmmaker. And I say that as a knowledgeable expert, not as his friend. His film documentaries are stellar because they take, I believe, his foundation of solid journalism and they go to a different medium. So I also know that Matt loves opera, so maybe we'll talk about that as well. So Matt, welcome.
Thank you.
My first question for you, I don't know if anyone's ever asked this of you. It's something I've wanted to ask you for about 20 years, so it's not related to current news. Would you define the word elegance?
Elegant. That's a curveball question, Fred. I think the elegance is assurance, confidence, and understatedness, and a firm point of view. I think that's elegance.
Okay, that is you. Okay. Yeah. When people have asked me to explain you in a word, I've always said elegant, even though I've never said that to you, because I had no idea whether that my concept of it would equal your concept of it, but apparently it does. So your journalism is done with elegance. Your documentary filmmaking is done with elegance. But I think that sometimes elegance, when not properly understood, can be very shallow. Not your elegance, but I think it's often surface. It's what in Italian is often called bella figura, which is a behavioral thing. It's about pleasing someone else or making a good impression, rather than the kind of philosophy that you just articulated so well that I could have just closed the interview right there. But there's something else that I want to talk to you about. You, in my view, use your senses very, very well. They are attuned, all of them, as a journalist should be, to what we call hard news. And I'm going to give some definitions here for people who may not be always focusing on journalism. Or actually, you define hard news.
Hard news. Well, I mean, I'm so obsessed with the news and the way it's reported right now because we're in such a frightening transition period. I don't want to give too long an answer, but I really am thinking about this all the time. I'll talk about it in the negative about what I miss. I miss when there was a Walter Cronkite and a John Chancellor. These were the old school journalists who actually started as newspaper journalists, but became the voices of the big three networks in this country. And they were consensus people. And that's really what I'm now talking about. The New York Times, for all its faults, and they've been there for decades, more than a century probably, was the paper of record, is what it's often called and called itself. But you could look to it for an agreed upon consensus that conformed to an agreed upon agenda. And journalists at that time would call it the first draft of history. So that, I think, is getting at what hard news is, because the journalists are the interpreter and the filter. They're the eye on the scene, and they have to transmit it to the public at large. And the first draft of that is hard news.
And where does the concept of truth enter into all of this?
Well, it's the best version of the truth attainable in the moment. And that's what a daily newspaper is supposed to do. And then it was overtaken in importance by, in the United States and in other countries too, wealthy countries probably, by TV news. And there was this moment of, I'd say, probably the mid to late 60s through the late 80s and early 90s, when I think that was at its high crest, and there was an agreed upon agenda. I'm not saying it was the right agenda, but at the time it was a kind of functional agenda that was appropriate for a liberal democracy. And the New York Times, and I would say the big three networks in the United States were the purveyors of that, and really the symbols of it. And we're losing that because of the atomization of the news business, if you want to call it that. And it used to be called the public trust as well in the United States. And that concept really went out the window, and the World Wide Web hastened its defenestration.
For people who are not in the United States, or for ignorant Americans, what is the First Amendment and the concept of freedom of speech, freedom of the press?
Well, it's enshrined in the Constitution in the First Amendment that there shall be freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I should be able to recite the clauses to you, and I shamefully cannot. There's some catches in there, and it's been tested in the Supreme Court, most famously in the United States. You have freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. That's generally the
unless there's a fire.
Yeah, that's correct.
That happened in Torino many years ago.
Right.
So now I'm introducing another word to hard news, but put it with hard news: art.
Art. Well, I think I might know what you're getting at, and I also think about this a lot. I would say that art is transfiguration of the commonplace, and then if you want to get critical about it, something that passes the test of time. I would say those two things define art for me.
And also the freedom of expression and issues of freedom of expression in art is something I think about a lot. For listeners who don't know, yes, I've worked in opera since, 1972, 50 years, I was a baby. But also I have practiced as a professional journalist since 1980. And I've published 9 books, and I've done a lot of broadcasting before Fred Plotkin on Fridays, and have done both careers. And you can imagine that I've been asked to be an opera critic for newspapers many, many times, and I always turn it down because I don't want that mindset when I'm looking at art, in this case opera, but also because I don't want to criticize colleagues. If I have issues with what they're doing and they're friends, I'll bring it to them privately to try to help them rather than put it out in the public space that I think Miss So-and-so should give up a role because she's no longer able to perform it. I would never say that kind of thing publicly. But I graduated from journalism school in New York City in 1980. And we, the United States, had a terrible economy. American hostages were being held in Iran. Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter were running for presidency. And Matt, I'm going to talk to you about Ronald Reagan. And there were no jobs available for journalists. And one of the three major networks offered me a senior producer position right out of Columbia Journalism School for their morning program where people wake up and say, "Good morning, America." And the show was turning at that time toward entertainment and away from news. And I had, by experience, but also in journalism school, been told that there has to be a separation between entertainment and news. Now, I think it's fair to say that even in the 1950s on the morning shows in America, when they had monkeys co-hosting with Barbara Walters and Hugh Downs, that yes, there was entertainment. But even though I was told that there would be no other jobs available, I turned down the job because I did not want to accept that. My dean of my school was horrified because my classmates were mostly not getting work, but I just felt that I could not compromise that. Mm-hmm. And if I wanted to go into entertainment, I would. And I consider opera entertainment, yes, but also art. You have been exposed by the things that you cover to really hard news, which is to say politics, corruption, crime, the worst kind of human behavior, but also to people who are glamorous, glitzy, Hollywood, New York, whatever you want to call that, London, Milan, Rome. You've been there and you were there as a witness, but a journalist of your stature, let's not pretend, can also, if he allows it, become a protagonist. How have you negotiated that line and where have you stepped?
Well, I'm not a hard news journalist, really, in that I'm not a daily news journalist. I would be a terrible deadline journalist for a number of reasons, temperament, and I'm not a fast writer, terrible speller. That doesn't really matter anymore. Yeah. And I'm more of I'm a cultural interpreter, which I think a daily news journalist is to an extent, but you're really not supposed to be. You're really supposed to just, write the solid lead and put the facts out. That, as a consumer of news, that's interesting to me, but as a journalist, that's not really what excites me. The thrill of the deadline, that type of pressure doesn't excite me. I'm really a long form journalist and a feature journalist in print. And I would say an observational journalist. Now, you can, I think, fairly become a protagonist in your observational pieces, which tend to be long form. That became enshrined in something called the new journalism, which rose up in the 60s and is personified by Gay Talese and Joan Didion and Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe. And many others, Hunter Thompson. They're a cohort of people that kind of transformed that form and made their mark. And that stood the test of time in many ways, I think. And that part of new journalism was making the journalist a protagonist. And it was controversial at the time. People didn't like it. I'm sure, the mandarins of the New York Times, I'm sure, hated it. It really went against everything that they stood for. And they probably, at that time, there were probably discussions about barbarians at the gate, and this is the end of the news business. And, one of them, Gay Talese, then kind of turned on the New York Times. I think he had started out there, but then wrote a kind of really piercing biography of the institution.
Power and the Glory, is that what it was called?
Hang on, I'll think of it in a
Kingdom
second.
and the Power?
I think, I think that's it. But the reason I'm bringing this up, this notion that things were coming to an end in the 60s and 70s with new journalism is like, oh boy, they didn't know what was coming. You know, I think journalism survived new journalism very well, thank you. And in fact, I think it contributed mightily to the form. And I think today things have changed in a way that are really frightening and unhealthy and kind of degrading to the business. But at that time, making yourself a protagonist in the story was controversial. It was very popular. It sold books. We wouldn't have things like All the President's Men, which was the bookification of the straight reporting of two reporters at the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, who couldn't put themselves in the story when they were writing for the paper, but when they got their book contract, new journalism was very much in the air at the time, and that's the way they wrote that book. That book is not a straight account of Watergate. That book is a procedural where the writers made themselves the star, actually, of the story, and then it was made into one of the best adaptations of a book ever, All the President's Men, the film.
With handsome, talented actors replacing ink-stained journalists.
Yeah.
Actually, Watergate was my next question for you, because you are 12 or 13 years younger than I am. And we all know the film, or we should, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, where Maggie Smith, as Jean Brodie says, in a better Scottish accent than I have, give me a gal at 5 years old, she'll be a Brodie girl for life. And in other words, there's an imprinting that happens on children.
Yeah.
And I think that this imprinting happens at different ages for different things. I know my imprinting for music probably came about 4 or 5. My imprinting for Italy probably came at 4 or 5 and was a passion all through my childhood. My imprinting for other things came later. My sense of fairness just manifested very, very early, and I was often punished for speaking up when I thought people were being treated unfairly. I was slapped. I was sent to the principal's office by teachers when I would raise my hand at 7 and say, "You're not treating her properly." And the sense of fairness, of egalitarianism, struck me very early. And one of your musical selections is something we're going to get to in that regard. But my imprinting for journalism came with the Watergate era, which was 1974. And many of the people who went to Columbia Journalism School in the mid and late 70s and early 80s were formed by Watergate, by the sense that journalism could make improvements, could bring fairness, could defend the defenseless and prosecute the indefensible. And what was your imprinting, because you are 12 years younger than I am?
It's the same, actually, via television. So I was a toddler when Watergate was on TV, and the TV was always on in the house. Mm-hmm. And my parents were interested in the news, and I was interested too. As a really young kid, I was just really fascinated with it and watched it. And you know, I remember there's like a cute kid story that was told about me where you know, the words would get repeated in these hearings. It always happens. And one of them was misconduct. And I asked someone, an adult, who is misconduct? So clearly I was watching, if not fully comprehending, but there was a milieu to that I really found fascinating, and I was absolutely imprinted by it. Then there was a glamour, by the way, to journalism. I think really All the President's Men is almost entirely responsible for that. I mean, you know, in movie history, there's The Front Page and Citizen Kane and films like that that make journalism out to be really glamorous and fun, and the kind of the hack story of journalism too is also fun and really alluring. But then, I mean, this redefined it, and the way that movie's shot, where the Washington Post newsroom looks like, you know, forget Mad Men. I mean, the set design of that is really amazing. I mean, it's this white, pristine space with, you know, beautifully colored desks. It has a modern thing in glass-walled offices where Jason Robards is holding court as Ben Bradley. I mean, I probably saw that movie on cable when I was a kid, you know, maybe like, I don't know, in elementary school. And I was completely taken with all of that too. So that's it. I think that's.
But then there's a movie, because you grew up in Hollywood in California, and even for people who are not necessarily in the film industry, though I know some of your relatives were in television and perhaps film, it's the company town for the movies and for American cinema. And there's also the film Ace in the Hole. I don't know if you know that film.
I do, yeah.
Kirk Douglas, which takes a very different view of the journalist, as in he's making someone, it's a bit like the scene in The Front Page where they want to capture the woman jumping out the window and committing suicide rather than prevent her from committing suicide. And Ace in the Hole, there's someone, the journalist is down on his luck, and there's someone trapped in a mine or a cave. And it's a better story if he dies than if he lives.
Yeah.
And there is that side of journalism. There has always been that side of journalism, which used to be called yellow journalism.
Yeah, well, Citizen Kane's about that too. I neglected to mention His Girl Friday, which is the another version of The Front Page, I think.
Where Rosalind Russell replaces well, I know the later version to the Jack Lemmon character, but Hildy is the name of the character. Yeah, I forget who played it in 1931.
It was originally a male character, and they made it a female character for Rosalind.
And then in 41, it was female, and then with the Billy Wilder version, it was a male again, Jack Lemmon.
Well, Billy Wilder is the director of Ace in the Hole as well. I think he had been a journalist in Berlin, actually. Yeah. So it's very intuitive view. So the Ace in the Hole is a movie I saw in high school or college. In film school, basically, or film class in high school. And that movie, the cynicism of that movie, I think was important to me. I love Billy Wilder. Sunset Boulevard goes in and out as my favorite movie. Ace in the Hole is a cynical take on this about yellow journalism and the way that news is manipulated for profit or personal gain or glory, et cetera. This is something we're dealing with in spades today. So that cynicism really influenced me as well. And I think you can see the two things as sort of the idealism of the Watergate journalism and the glamour and the Hollywood of it. And then there's that cynical take, which is more narrative and more meta, and those two things braiding together equal really Vanity Fair, which is where I'm a journalist. That's where I started my journalism.
But I've known several Vanity Fair journalists, and I think I can fairly say that some of them put both feet on one side of the entertainment versus journalism line. Some put both on the other side, and some have one foot in each. And the magazine evolved with its different editors, but I'm not here so much to talk about Vanity Fair as to talk about you. Hard news and entertainment, as opposed to hard news and art, is, I think, a more recent development. I began to talk about that when I was talking about the morning show in 1980, where I was offered a job. But I think with the rise of Rupert Murdoch and his networks and his newspapers, and the way Ronald Reagan and his administration allowed laws to be changed so that a media mogul could acquire many platforms, let's call them, I hate the word, but in other words, radio, television, newspapers, magazines, book publishers, and so on.
Mhm.
When that changed, hard news and entertainment became a blur to me. I don't know what you think.
Oh, I think it's even more important and grave than that. I would agree with that. I mean, the person you refer to who was then able to own multiple platforms in the same market, this was the law the FCC had, the regulation was that you couldn't own a TV station and a newspaper in the same market.
FCC being Federal Communications Commission. Yeah.
Yes, and the person you're referring to was Rupert Murdoch. And the law was changed in the Reagan administration. And Murdoch then was allowed to own the New York Post and a television station in the New York City market, which then became Fox, the Fox News Channel, basically. Mm-hmm. That was the beginning of this. Reagan personally signed off on it, and the person who lobbied for Murdoch to get that done was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn is the subject of a film of mine.
I'm going to add an adjective: magnificent film of yours.
Thank you.
Although I was nauseated, but it was not because of the filmmaking, but because of the subject.
It's an important subject for people to know about. He was almost a forgotten figure.
Say who he was.
Yeah, so he had
Cohn.
A very long career, even though he died relatively young. He was sort of a wunderkind. He was the right-hand man and kind of the Iago to Joseph McCarthy, who was the most dangerous demagogue of the 1950s in the United States.
Republican senator from Wisconsin.
Known for his communist witch hunting and blacklisting. He was the personification of a lot of really dark impulses that are usually underneath the surface in American politics, but occasionally burble up, and he was that period's personification. Cohn, as a 20-something, was the chief counsel to his Senate committee, which was persecuting alleged members of the Communist Party, and also people that were suspected of being degenerates, which at that period meant homosexuals.
Many of them in Hollywood.
In Hollywood, but in the army, all throughout institutions in the United States. It was pure demagoguery. Cohn then was disgraced along with his boss, McCarthy, and then he became basically a mob lawyer in New York City. He reinvented himself instantaneously and became the darling of the cafe society, New York, roughly. New York has a lot of these cultural circles, and he became sort of the mayor of a lot of them. He was sort of like the legal, political rapscallion personified, and New York always needs that figure. It's had it since it began.
I would just disagree. Not needs. New York endures these figures. We don't need them at all.
Yeah, the media industrial complex
that
requires them for the public narrative of New York. And there have been a few mayors that were that. One named James J. Walker was one of those. Cohn became that all throughout the late 20th century. Then he became unbelievably, the creator, really, of Donald Trump, the Donald we know. He was the early mentor of a young, ambitious, rich kid from Queens with a real estate portfolio that daddy had given him. And Cohn probably had a kind of like crush on him and celibate, one-sided love affair with him. And boosted him and really got him his book deal. Mm-hmm. He was best friends, Cohn, with Cy Newhouse, who was one of the great media barons of the period. A relatively progressive person, Cy Newhouse, but somehow had
Except he wouldn't eat garlic. That was my only complaint about him. The cafeteria, they would never allow garlic to be served in any of the dishes.
That's power, Fred. But Newhouse and Cohn went to Horace Mann, which was a fancy high school in New York, together, and they stayed lifelong friends. And all of these elements boosted Trump through the ecosystem of New York. And then he became a public joke for decades, and then somehow the joke was on us. So that's how we got to now, and that's really what my movie does. But Cohen, you can see how insidious a player he was. He's the one that lifted this regulation that really empowered Murdoch to build a demagogic right-wing news organization. And that's too much power concentrated in the hands of one person or a few people. And that's probably the big problem we have in the US right now. Trump is a symptom of that. He's not the cause, as people frequently say.
But something that you alluded to now in your discussion, but also is clear in not just that film, but other works of yours, is the degree to which the power structures, whether they are government, media, Wall Street, economic, religion, tend to all lie down in one big filthy bed together often and create sort of all kinds of disaster for the world. In my view, the environment is a big question here, but also for people who don't necessarily have the means, the resources, the health, whatever, to be able to stand up and receive what they need to receive. Matt, I want to go back and have you talk about two people whose names are largely forgotten, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg.
Rosenbergs were a Jewish couple in New York, who were tagged as communist spies and the leakers of atomic secrets to the Soviet Union in the late 40s and early 1950s. There was a Red Scare in this country. Joseph McCarthy did a lot to propagate that. It was a lot of BS, really. I mean, there were communists who were double agents in the US government, but they never really did a lot of damage. But the demagoguery around that created what's known as the Red Scare. And the demagogue who got very far until he collapsed under the weight of his own indecency was Joe McCarthy, and his brain really was Roy Cohn. So the Rosenbergs became the poster people, really, for that terrible moment. It was confirmed eventually when I think the Stasi archives, or the Soviet KGB archives maybe, were opened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Julius Rosenberg was indeed giving secrets. But it was pretty well confirmed that the Russians or the Soviets had that technology anyway. It was something to do with a mirror that was a part of the igniter of a hydrogen bomb, I think.
And Ethel was innocent.
Yeah, Ethel was surely innocent.
And betrayed by her brother.
Yes, David Greenglass. It's a terrible story of betrayal and panic and family issues and a disgraceful demagoguery. It's one of the lowest moments in American history, for sure. But Cohn comes into it because there was a fever to prosecute communists, and maybe Jewish communists, as an added attraction to that, which would help with a demagogic agenda. It's, in this country and in many others, you always need an other. So at that time, many people were the others. At that time, Jews were among them, homosexuals.
And that was 4 years after a film called Gentleman's Agreement. No, 7 years after a film called Gentleman's Agreement, which was one of the first films to address anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Openly, yeah.
So one footnote to this is the Justice Department in the United States was not known for its partiality to Jewish people, but they didn't want to have a PR problem as they prosecuted this Jewish couple, kind of like lower middle class Jewish couple in New York. So they purposely hired an all Jewish prosecution team, and Cohn got on that. He got that job, and he was a real baby then. I think he was just out of law school, and his father had been a judge and aced him into that. And he really cut his teeth on this. He ended up being a sort of mesmerizer of the judge in the case, named Irving Sapol, who lived in the same building as the Cohns did. The Cohns were wealthy. And he basically dictated the sentencing of the people whom he was prosecuting, which is not allowed. But there was a famous phone call made to Judge Saypool from the phone booth outside of Park Avenue Synagogue, which is one of the great footnotes of this story. Yeah. And Cohen is said to have said to Saypool, give Ethel the chair. And the Rosenbergs were both electrocuted. So Cohen is very much responsible for the murder of an innocent woman by the state. Even if Julius was guilty of some things he was charged, I don't believe in the death penalty. And this was a really noxious moment in American history, brought to you by, in part, Roy Cohn.
Who created Donald Trump. Matt, I'm going to say something that I've never said publicly anywhere ever, but you're a tough journalist and you're pulling it out of me. My name is Fred or Frederick. I was named for 3 Fredericks. One of them was Fred Astaire, and because we have the same birthday, but also because my parents did not agree on the other 2 Freds. So they agreed that I could be named for Fred Astaire because both of them love Fred Astaire. Another was the composer Frederick Delius, and the other was someone you may have read his works, Frederick Wertham, Wertham, who was born in Germany, studied with Freud, lived in New York, and was a counselor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, whatever you want, to prisoners. And he was Ethel Rosenberg's psychiatrist when she was on death row, and heard all of her anxiety. Most especially, she knew she was going to die. She knew that she was innocent. He wrote it down, and his notes were later found and verified. But she was, number one, she couldn't understand what was happening. But number 2, they had 2 small boys. Mm-hmm. And what would happen to the boys? And out of respect for their privacy, I'm not going to bring up, they're fine. But obviously they were marked by these horrible episodes in which the government killed their parents. And I've interacted, not recently, but in my childhood with the boys. Mm-hmm. And they, in certain New York circles, this was an imprinting and a life changer, even though it happened before I was born. But if you grew up in New York in the 50s and 60s, you all knew the story of the Rosenbergs and their sons and everything around it, which leads me, my friend, to one of your selections. As listeners know, I ask my guests to provide musical choices that are meaningful to them. And one of the ones you picked is Leonard Bernstein and Lillian Hellman's and Hugh Wheeler's Candide, based on the book that's my second favorite book after Don Quixote. And Dr. Pangloss in the book and in the musical, in the opera, whatever you want to call it, has a formulation that imprinted on me very young and is also the way I look at the world. Everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Now, Voltaire knew what he was writing there, because everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And Bernstein and Hellman were saying that the 1950s, and Candide was written right after all of this happened. And while McCarthyism was still rampant and Lillian Hellman had been called up to testify and name names, and she wouldn't do it, and made a whole career on having not done it. Everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Matt, how does that read to you?
Well, I mean, there's a term, Panglossian. So, I mean, I see the opera. I mean, I made another movie. I'm just going to talk about a movie I made called Scotty and the Secret History of Hollywood, which is sort of a sexual Candide. More sexual Candide. I found a real life Candide, I think, in this in this person's
Talk about Scotty Powers. It's
Scotty
another
Powers.
wonderful film. I'm just going to say that I'm going to ask you to say the website of your company because I want people to go there. Altimeter or Altimeter? Altimeter Films?
In the UK, it seems to be Altimeter, but in the USA, it's altimeterfilms.com. And
okay.
You can find the list of films there.
Yeah.
Scotty Powers was the pimp to the stars, basically, from the World War II until he died, I think, 2 years ago at 96. Almost 97. I met him through Gore Vidal, who was a friend and mentor of mine, and Scotty was
very much a Dr. Pangloss.
Absolutely. I will quote Gore Vidal. Scotty was my pimp. But I didn't think Scotty Powers was alive. I had heard about him through various people in that kind of sector of society, and then I found out he was alive, and so I found the subject of my next film. But I didn't realize it was kind of like a Candide-like tale. Actually, Scotty was an eternal optimist and never paid much attention to the absolutely unspeakable horrors that he witnessed. World War II as a Marine in the South Pacific would be one, and the death of his daughter from a illegal abortion would be another, and then the HIV/AIDS crisis, which as what we would now term a sex worker, he survived. And
he had a wife, Lois, who was an unusual character.
Yes, exactly. Married to a woman, Lois, and I guess you've got to see the movie really to try to understand how all this worked, but it did. It did.
It's a wonderful film. I think that people who are prudes will not like it or will be a little put off by it, but I say go with an open mind because this stuff happens not just in Hollywood. It happens in Florida. It happens in Texas. It happens in Idaho. It happened in the past all over Europe, and I'm sure still does, but with different attitudes in a way than it does here, because of American society's, call it ambivalence, call it hypocrisy about sexual issues. But I don't want people to think that this is just a sex film, because that's like saying Le Nozze di Figaro, which was another of your recommendations, is just a sex comedy. There is a lot of sex in Le Nozze di Figaro. And in fact, I saw a wonderful performance last night at the Metropolitan Opera. Really a great performance with a great cast led by the Count of Gerald Finley to be one of the greatest opera singers in the world. And I don't say publicly because I work in opera who are the greatest, but Gerald Finley is one of the greatest opera singers in the world, and I will see him in anything. And he was just fantastic as the Count last night. And you happened to recommend some music from the Count's music. But the point here is that sex has always been with us, or we wouldn't be here. And therefore, how's that for a formulation? That's my Panglossian formulation. But it's the way it's depicted and thought about. We're often taught that in polite conversation, you don't talk about politics, religion, or sex. And if that were the case, we would not have opera. Because almost all opera is either about politics, religion, or sex, or sometimes all of them. And Verdi's Don Carlo, Boris Godunov doesn't have much sex, but it has a lot of politics and religion. And these are defining things about the human experience. And some of them are equal across the board, like sex. Politics exist, but they're practiced differently everywhere. Religions, plural, exist. And then there are people who are not religious. For example, the son of Ronald and Nancy Reagan, Ron Reagan Jr., is a famous atheist, and he says he's not afraid to burn in hell. The only work of yours, Matt, that I have not seen is your programs, I think plural, about the Reagans. Oh. And I know that you interviewed Ron Reagan Jr. among many people. Would you talk about why you set about to do a program about the Reagans? But especially I want people to know you grew up in California in the film zone, let's call it, but then he was governor of California when you were a little kid.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that he was governor
Okay.
when I was little. I remembered first Jerry Brown, who was it was interesting. California in the 60s and then the 70s into the early 80s had two opposing governorships, really. They were almost diametric. And Reagan was the first, and then his successor was the diametric of Ronald Reagan, Jerry Brown, who then became governor later again. I think he had a total of 4 terms. So it was really a perfect contrast between the rising tide of what was known as the hard right, which was Reagan. He kind of reinvented it for the modern era. And Jerry Brown,
a softer take than Barry Goldwater, who I think may have come a few years before and articulated things that Reagan was able to smooth out.
yes,
or lie
I
about.
think. Well, yeah, I think if you understand what happened there, you understand everything you need to know about the 20th century and the first part of the current one in American politics, which is that Barry Goldwater, who was a senator from Arizona and the presidential nominee for the Republicans in 1964, was considered to be a right-wing extremist who had some crazy people among his followers, and they were known at that time as the John Birch Society. They would be you call them now QAnon or anything, fever swamp people. That was there, and people were appalled. The general populace was appalled, and he was trounced and went down to, I think, up to that moment, the largest defeat in American history, Lyndon Johnson.
Until Reagan defeated Mondale.
Yeah, exactly.
In 84, yeah.
But the Republicans had a major problem at that time in that they were, there was a right-wing tide emerging in the party. It was a coalition of political right-wing people and crazy people. And they needed to, and Goldwater was a scary figure because he came off as kind of pro-nuclear war. And he moderated later in his life, actually, but at the time he had a harsh demeanor, and it didn't come across well on television, which was becoming the most important thing about politics at the time. So what happened is the rich anti-establishment money class in this country were in California at the time. And they loved Barry Goldwater, but they realized if they wanted to put their agenda across, which is really the agenda we're living with today in right-wing politics, which is low taxes for the rich and nothing for anyone else, they needed to find a super salesman who was telegenic to put that over. And they chose Ronald Reagan, and they chose very well. Now, at the time, Reagan, and this is why I made this 4-part series on Ronald Reagan, but it's called The Reagans because it's really about Ronald and Nancy Reagan. At the time, Ronald Reagan was considered to be a lightweight and a joke who was unelectable, almost a clown. And that should remind you of someone else. He really was considered to be a lightweight on the order of a Trump, before Trump succeeded in capturing the presidency. So history's repeated itself. Of course, Trump makes Reagan look incredibly substantive and reasonable. But the reason I made the series, The Reagans, to get back to your question, is to explain how we got to now as a sequel to my Roy Cohn film, which was also to explain how we got to now. So these are intertwined stories that show you the origin of the harsh turn to the right that American politics has taken. All of the seeds were planted in the post-war era. And the McCarthy period, and Cohn and Reagan was a major player in that period as well. He had a different style in a certain way. He navigated it rather cleverly, wasn't officially in politics yet, so he emerged unscathed. Roy Cohn was a great friend of the Reagans and was very helpful in getting Reagan elected in 1980. And then when Reagan actually got real power, when he was elected president of the United States, his policies really set the stage for what we're reaping now. All of this began to be institutionalized in the 80s, which was the dismantling of institutions and the disregard for government of any type, and something Trump did that people were outraged by, but Reagan did the same thing, which was appointing people to head federal agencies who were interested in dismantling their own agencies. So it was a contempt for government and a contempt for the people, because in the system in the United States, the people are sovereign. So when you have contempt for the government, you have contempt for the sovereigns, and the sovereigns are the people, which is, of course, since no one knows any civics or history in the United States, is not really widely understood. But that's what happened in the Reagan period, and it built and built and built, and that's where we are today. So those two films are meant to go together. One's a series. And I'm surprised to this day how you hear on podcasts about politics and read in op-eds these great revelations about how all of this really might have started back in the 80s with Reagan. I mean, everyone should know this. It should be really fully understood, but I think it's almost incomprehensible because of the incredible skill that Reagan and his supporters had for getting the image across, which is the unsubstantive part of politics, and often supersedes the substantive part of politics, which is the art of stagecraft, not stagecraft, but that was a appropriate slip. And versus
talk about Reagan and Nancy Reagan and their administration's relationship with attitude toward the arts. And I don't mean just the performing arts and cinema, obviously, but the visual arts, because the 80s produced a lot of art and a lot of good stuff, a lot of junk too. It was a thriving era at the Metropolitan Opera with great singers and a lot of great productions and financial stability. And they also, well, you talk about them, about how you think they interacted with and affected the arts.
Well, actually, my understanding of it changed when I studied them to make this series. I mean, I actually love old Hollywood movies, and I'm not opposed to Ronald Reagan in an old Hollywood film. Nancy Reagan, Nancy Davis had a kind of strange Hollywood career as well. I mean, it's kind of incredible to see them co-starring in Hellcats of the Navy. I mean, for me, it's still an out-of-body experience that this is happening. So the Reagans, the way I misunderstood them is I just thought they were Philistines. And to a large degree, I think they were. But they were sort of selective Philistines, and because they were a power couple, even in Hollywood, a sort of in the right-wing category, which is a strange category in Hollywood. It very much exists. People think it doesn't because of Jane Fonda and a lot of other liberal, Robert Redford, all these actors of the 70s.
Jane Fonda in The Butler played Nancy Reagan.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I love that. Well, Jane Fonda, who looks amazing and I've had dinner with her once or twice, and is incredibly entertaining and really smart. But she's definitely, her aesthetic has moved much more toward Nancy than Hanoi Jane.
Yeah.
It's aesthetic. She looks really good. Now,
and by the way, I do want to say this publicly. Jane Fonda has to be given a Kennedy Center honor. She is way overdue.
Yeah, you're right about that.
And I sometimes send nominations, and a couple of the people I've nominated in the past have been given the honor. Yeah, I'm not going to judge any of the other people who got it, but she is way overdue for Kennedy Center honor.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
But when you learn more about the Reagans, you find all these strange footnotes. Well, first of all, everyone actually really liked Ronald Reagan in Hollywood. I mean, I am vehemently against him politically, and I actually found his rhetoric to be really frightening and harsh. But I've now proven to myself something I didn't believe, that he was such an affable man, and even people who didn't agree with him politically really liked him, and he was. You can't deny it. So he was popular around town, and he was a big movie star. I mean, he was a kind of a favorite of Jack Warner's and made some big films, and his career kind of fizzled for various reasons, so he never really got up to the Henry Fonda, Gregory Peck level. Never became
or William Holden, who was best man at his wedding to Nancy.
Yeah, which is another out-of-body experience to see that photograph, by the way. And actually, just to gossip about the Reagans and their social life, William Holden was a great Hollywood liberal, and Ronald Reagan had been a great Hollywood liberal, and they were best friends at the time. And Reagan's conversion to crazed conservatism is really the subject of the series. So if you want to know the details of that, you can see that there. But it's on Showtime is the platform in the United States for it. But they knew everybody and were pretty well liked. Gore Vidal always said that the problem with Ronnie Reagan was that he was really boring, actually. So he was fun to say hi to casually, but everyone would kind of like try to dodge him at a party because he wouldn't stop talking. And Jane Wyman, who was his first movie star wife and actually eclipsed him as a star, which was part of the problem.
She won an Oscar. Johnny Belinda.
Johnny Belinda, and she and I think Reagan said that either the Oscar or Johnny Belinda were the co-respondent in his divorce, because she eclipsed the man as the bigger star, which was not done largely at the time.
But just about William Holden, I'm sorry, didn't Holden migrate and become a Republican? I think he did.
He might have.
I'm pretty sure he did, although he was very much environmentalist and about saving wildlife in Africa, but I think he moved Republican.
But he just must have been a Rockefeller Republican, Fred. I just can't believe it. I won't tolerate the thought. But the joke that Jane Wyman told about Ronnie Reagan was, you ask Ronnie what time it is and he tells you how to make the clock. I think that explains probably what was happening. In any event, they knew everybody, and they knew they were friends with the really big substantive stars. And I always thought, because I grew up in a liberal kind of like Hollywood household, I was like, these people were considered jokes. Nancy was considered to be a dragon lady, which I think she really was, and she was not very popular. Ronnie was the popular one. Okay. But James Cagney was their great friend, and
Well, he was my favorite Hollywood actor.
Yeah, I mean, they were closest probably to Cagney.
Yeah.
I find that in Hollywood, there's the A list and the B list, and eventually the Reagans were on the B list until they became politically powerful, and then they went back on the A list. But then the Jane Fonda people wouldn't talk to them, and that's the story of the 60s and 70s. But I kind of couldn't believe this. Like, Jimmy Cagney is like going over to the Reagans? That's so beneath him. That would be my take.
Well, he too started out, he was in labor unions and he was a liberal. He migrated and became quite conservative late in his life.
Yeah, well,
although he too was a conservationist. There's something about it used to be that protecting the environment and the lands was not cognizant of political party.
Well, Reagan kind of missed that memo. He loved the outdoors and riding a horse, but he was thrilled to have offshore drilling and a mine dug, as long as it wasn't too near his ranch, which the studios gave him twice for free. The Reagans were kind of high-class grifters. I know we're supposed to be talking about the arts here, but if you really want to know the secrets to the Reagans, they were very classy grifters, and they lived on public assistance at the very highest level. And this is very crushing to people who worship them. And my series upset a lot of people, which was absolutely the intention, and I'm very proud of it. The arts, though, what they would pay lip service to the arts in a kind of Helen Hayes, First Lady of the American Theater, let's have her to the state dinner way. They wanted the classy patina of Hollywood, and the the gloss of Hollywood always was that. And they were very much in that circle when it was coherent back in the old days. And then the other secret, by the way, to Reagan, which has to do with this, is that he was really the creation early in his career of Luella Parsons, who was one of the two most powerful gossip columnists in the United States and happened to be from the same small town as Ronald Reagan
in Illinois. I didn't know that.
Both from Dixon, Illinois.
Yeah.
Well, this is luck for Reagan because you cannot explain how powerful this woman was, along with Hedda Hopper. They really ran the town. Even the studio heads cowered in fear of these women.
Mm-hmm.
Who were really powerful and good newspaper women, but they were gossip columnists. And Luella Parsons promoted Reagan's career. So, but she was, they were fierce anti-communists, et cetera, et cetera. So they worked that system really well. And when it came to having power and cultural influence, they did prove themselves really to be Philistines. I mean, they weren't really interested in the higher arts or the opera. I mean, I think Nancy.
Well, I'm going to push back a little on that. I have never met an American president, unless you count Al Gore, but I did know two first ladies, and one of them was Nancy Reagan. Mm-hmm. Because when I was performance manager of the Met, Mrs. Reagan was first lady. And on her first visit, they had to go through all the security and the provisions. And I'll tell you that story privately sometime, Matt, because it would take an hour right now. But I got to know her then, and she got my private phone number at the Met. And when she wanted to return, rather than go through all the stuff that they did the first time, she would just call me directly and say, if I can attend on the following night for the following performance, would you just set up the apparatus as before? Right. And I would join her for tea in the private room where she was not demanding, I must say. Mm-hmm. And I always thought it was because she grew up in show business and therefore understood our needs at the Metropolitan Opera about getting the show on. And she was very respectful, genuinely so, about not interfering with our putting a show on for 4,000 people.
Yes.
And she spoke about opera to me. I avoided politics because I just didn't want to go there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't doubt that. And I think the respect for the performer is entirely her. And that was her job with her husband, because he was a performer. He wasn't a really, in some areas, he might have been a little more substantive than he got credit for from the left at the time. But, he really wasn't the most substantive of presidents. He was a superb performer in the public arena for his time. He was the perfect person for his time. Hard as it is for me to admit that, because it never worked for me. I never really got the act, but clearly it worked. And her job was to be the studio head stage manager of one man. And she knew what that was. And she put all of her might into it, and she was incredibly successful at it. There would be no President Reagan without Nancy Reagan. And the thing you detected, I'm sure, is true. I would probably say that if she could have had a quiet dinner with Jerry Zipkin, who was, a completely vapid New York socialite, and maybe, I don't know, Casey Ribakov, and skipped the performance, I bet she might have opted for that. I would imagine.
Oh, she actually came alone.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, at least 5 times.
I accept this.
She called me up and said, Fred, it's Mrs. Reagan.
Can't be.
And I would say, hello, Mrs. Reagan. She said, well, I see that you have so-and-so singing. You have Ava Martone, and I've heard about her, and I'd like to come hear Ava Martone. Okay. And if possible, I'd like to attend, because I had to arrange where she could walk and not walk for all the obvious reasons. And easy.
Okay, this is news, I think, for historians, because there's a new Nancy book out now. There's not been a lot of good Nancy reporting, actually. At the time there was, because she was a holy terror in many ways, and she had way too much hidden influence Because she hid it, I think it was illegitimate. If she hadn't hidden it, I think it would have been actually not illegitimate, but it was covert. No one has reported anything like that, and that's news to me, and I'm very interested to hear it. I will say, now her mother was a very bright woman and a actress and a social force and kind of a early feminist in her own way. She was a traditionalist, but she really was, she was sort of a flapper and a woman of loose morals, which I say is a compliment. Edith Luckett. And she was very close friends with I'm going to mispronounce it, Alla Namozova. I'm getting the syllables wrong. Is that right?
Nazimova.
I always put the emphasis on the wrong syllable.
Nazimova, yeah.
Yeah, Nazimova, I think is right, who was a silent movie queen and a lesbian and a kind of an out lesbian and a really progressive force for the bohemian artistic society in Hollywood. And that is Nancy Reagan's godmother. So,
in my experience, I never found her in any way, quote, contemptuous of artistic types, whatever that might be called.
No, I think that's true. And I think she had gay friends, and I leap right to that. But I think she did a lot of harm to the gay community by sitting on her hands for way too long when bad policies were being propagated and
about HIV/AIDS,
which HIV/AIDS, but also a lot of really bad legislation to keep gay people from being teachers and things like that, which was happening in the 80s. And then there were the culture wars of the 80s, which they were awful on. And that's really what I think of when I think of them. The demagoguery of politicians like Jesse Helms, who would attack any A grants going to anybody but the most, seemingly benign or uncontroversial of artists. And most famously, a Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition was
photographer.
It was a gay photographer who had really transgressive aesthetics. And this became the first demagogue culture war over the arts in the modern era. And we're living with that playbook now. And the way that the arts is demagogue now is...
That's why I asked.
No, we got to that finally. And I think if I'm glad to hear that couldn't be more floored that she would go to the Met alone to see a particular singer. And I do think that's wonderful and makes me think better of her. However, that she wasn't telling Ronnie, whom she had almost, I would say 80% control over substantively, to cool it and make those people stop is really shameful. And this is, those crimes of omission are meaningful in that period.
We had many Met employees who died of AIDS in the 1980s, and I was their boss, manager, whatever. And they would turn their back when they saw her.
They should.
There is another figure who connects, whether you've named him or not, you probably did in your Reagan's programs, is Anthony Fauci. Who now has a very different status than he did in the 1980s, because we'll talk about who he is, was then, is now. Right. And do you think he's the subject for a film or an opera?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He's in my Reagan's film. I interviewed him about the Reagans, and it was at the height of the pandemic. And he agreed to be interviewed, very busy at the time, and he knew what it was about. And I think that's very telling in its own right that, I mean, this was the busiest man in the country at the time. And it was dangerous to be around other people, which he needed to be to do this. We did it outside. And he was incredible.
And he was then about 78 or 79 years old.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I'll just tell you what he said briefly, and then I'll talk. Well, actually, I should tell people who don't know, who aren't U.S. citizens watching. He's a high official at the National Institutes of Health, which is one of the innovating laboratories that's federally funded in this country. It's the leading one, and it's to protect people from infectious diseases. So he's the top infectious disease doctor in the federal government. He's been there since before the Reagan administration. I think in the same job. He started young and was successful young. At the time, he was public enemy number one almost. Reagan might have been number one, maybe public enemy number two among HIV/AIDS activists and concerned allies, because the NIH was slow to approve experimental drugs for compassionate use, was what it's called officially. And the activists at the time, led by people such as Larry Kramer, made Fauci a public enemy, and they were right to do so. And he has since apologized and recanted. And then Larry Kramer was one of his closest friends at his death. Now, one footnote that people don't know about Larry Kramer widely is that he died of COVID, which I think is a really painful irony, actually. That just guts me, that he had HIV, he survived it, he did as much as anyone to push experimental drugs to treat it, and COVID got him. I just think I blame Donald Trump for that, by the way. Yeah. But Fauci and Kramer became allies. Then eventually, and this is a great, the history of this is told in many places and brilliantly by many people. David France, a filmmaker, made a film called How to Survive a Plague, where a lot of this history is told. Fauci saw the error of his ways, but he was made to see it by the activists, who were very extreme in their techniques. They brought really like harsh measures of protest, and they would encamp inside Fauci's office or in the hallways of the NIH. This is real civil disobedience, and it worked. And Fauci, you know, he did a 180 and changed his position. So around that time, Reagan had an abysmal record on the HIV/AIDS pandemic. He definitely exploited it for politics, because he had made a political ally with right-wing religious lunatics like Jerry Falwell, who ran something called the Moral Majority. And this was the rise and the politicization of fundamentalist Christianity in this country. Reagan treated them as bedfellows. I love that. That's an accidental statement, but yeah, I'll stand by that. That they became a part of his coalition. And they were really responsible for getting him elected 2 times. Now, the HIV/AIDS was politicized by that wing of the party, and many people died. I mean, we're at genocide levels because the pandemic was mishandled for partially political reasons, and it was the villainization of gay people and the politicization of a medical issue and a virus. It's one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, and Fauci was involved. He changed his way of thinking about it and has publicly recanted. I talked about Reagan because I wanted to get it straight from him. And he was unvarnished in his critique. He said that it took way too long. He tried to explain, he tried to get on Reagan's schedule. He was kept away by the demagogues and people like the right wingers in the White House. Like I think a name like Pat Buchanan comes to mind, you know, who later became a politician in his own right. It's an tragedy.
I don't want to call him a pioneer, but he gave special definition to what we might call the culture wars.
Oh, Pat Buchanan, yeah.
Yeah, Pat Buchanan. And he became involved in media and broadcasting. And Fauci's a wonderful figure, and I think there should be an opera and definitely a film. But I'm going to pivot now, because we're talking about Pat Buchanan, but also the larger issue that we see in the United States, but not only. I certainly see it in Britain. I've seen it to some degree in Italy. I see it in France. I can't speak for Russia. And by the way, my love to everyone in the Ukraine. I always call that out. That's where my family's from, part of them. And the way there's a revolving door between media and politics and business, so that if you watch MSNBC, which tends to be more liberal, CNN, which is complex, Fox, which is more conservative, and then many other media outlets, let's call them. And we see people who are, quote, talking heads, who may have been a senator from Missouri or may have been a senator from Pennsylvania. And they're there representing what their political outlook might be. But if someone who's not as into media and government as you and I are watches this and sees a person talking and espousing an opinion, they can't distinguish. And there's no way to say so-and-so is a journalist, so-and-so is a reporter. You can do that, but then they become, quote, pundits or opinion makers. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, pundits tend to be wrong a lot of the time, but it's just a way of keeping people listening and watching the advertising that's sandwiched in among the broadcasts. This goes back to what I was saying about, I learned that there was a wall between hard news and news reporting and entertainment. Mm-hmm. And screen time, whether it's you and I are on Zoom, but televisions, phones, whatever, for most of the world, I think we've lost all sense of who the presenter is and what their background is, their agenda, their qualifications. Mm-hmm. And this is what worries me. And I think we have to put a warning label saying so-and-so was senator from Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum, and this is how he voted. And I would have a list next to his voting. Or Claire McCaskill from Missouri, this is how she voted.
MSNBC used to do that a bit. Yeah, and I agree with that. I just think there's a fundamental problem with education in the United States. I mean, people lament in, the quality magazines about how civics hasn't been taught in years. History is not really taught. I mean, I had a good education, and I'm just shocked at the things I wasn't taught actually at this point. I mean, they left out a lot. I had a kind of liberal, touchy-feely education, so I learned a lot.
You went to Wesleyan, correct?
Wesleyan. I went to a high school called Crossroads in LA, which is a arts high school that became a super fancy, still sort of liberal high school. But we were taught, we were kind of taught liberal skews on history. I mean, we weren't taught about the Iwo Jima and the battles of World War II, but we were taught about Japanese internment camps, which happened in California, and were very important to learn about, and weren't on the agenda of other schools. But it was funny, it was sort of skewed. We were taught about those things and not really taught about what happened in World War II. It's kind of, education is very imperfect. But my point is that there was a study done pre-rise of the internet that I think was important and echoes today, which is that Americans, because of the educational system and just because of the way the society is structured, with so many distractions and breaking up of community, blame everything, globalization, all the forces of modernity in the analog world that now have become mirrored in the digital world. The typical American is not able to process any complex political thought, an astonishing number. So what happens? They look to opinion leaders, and that can be anyone. In the analog times, it could be anyone from a Walter Cronkite, who really didn't give opinions. Occasionally he did. Famously, he gave one on the Vietnam War, which actually Lyndon Johnson then said upon seeing it in the Oval Office, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. Mm-hmm. So that's how important a consensus figure he was. But anyway, for me, that would be the best kind of opinion leader, perhaps, because it's a secular one. And I thought he was a great journalist. All the way down to, let's say, your barber, the guy who cuts your hair, who talks to you about politics, or Uncle Harry, who's a John Bircher, or these days a QAnon person, and political opinions are formed that way. Now, there's not a whole lot wrong with that. That's the way it's always been, but the lack of ability to take in and synthesize the information that's coming at you is really the problem. And a little more education in the right places would help a lot with that, probably. I don't know if it would completely overcome it. And then if you add the atomization of all this through the internet, that's a recipe for disaster, and we're living that right now.
Yeah.
That I think is the core of it. There are a million different ingredients in it, to exaggerate slightly, but the decline of local newspapers, or the cesspool of local television news. Which is really entertainment. That's infotainment, if you will, personified. And more people watch that than watch a lot of other stuff, or certainly read anything.
Many local news outlets, certainly New York City, don't have reporters or don't cover the state capitol doings in Albany. In the case of New York State, they don't have much covered at City Hall unless there's a fire, a murder, or a stabbing on the subway or something like that, or a shooting. But they don't cover policy. They don't cover the workings of government. And that's frankly the choice of the editors and the owners, because I know we're closing up, but I wanted to point out something that to you, Matt, I know is obvious, and to me, is that underneath news, at least most news in the world, apart from public broadcasting and a few other things, under much, though not all, art, and under most entertainment, is making money. And if they're not making money, then suddenly it's not a valid enterprise.
Yeah, well, yes, we'll never get out from under that, I don't think. In the United States, the system is just not built that way. The public funding for the arts is abysmal. The Reagans, that was cut a lot under Reagan, by the way, if you want to.
By the way, you know, the president who had the highest amount of funding for the arts was George H.W. Bush.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah. Bill Clinton, Obama came close, but George H.W. Bush had the most.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the Reagans cut all that in the name of small government, which was his mantra. And, that's a whole other discussion about the billionaire industrial complex, which is really what we've been talking about for the whole time now. So yes, there's bad public funding for the arts here. I've gotten an NEA grant. It was relatively small and very hard to get. I appreciated it. I was actually really honored to get it. To be
National Endowment for the Arts. NEA is National Endowment for the Arts. NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities.
Yeah, but they make them really hard to get, and
yes,
they're hard to do. So, as a result, you have show business, and I've learned now that I'm more in show business. I mean, we really didn't talk about the difference between documentary and news, which is a whole other podcast, but, they're different, they're similar, they elide frequently, but they're not always the same thing. So viewer beware. But the more I do that, and I almost entirely do that now, it's, not show art, it's show business. And it comes at you hard and fast when you're trying to get the money for things and when you're negotiating the contracts. And the more that documentary film becomes the replacement for what used to be the Oscar movies, like movies like Kramer versus Kramer, All the President's Men, even The Godfather would not be made for the screen these days. They'd be made for HBO or cable TV. I mean, the Sopranos is the current Godfather, right? But they're really...
well, I thought it was about opera.
Not one of my... But it's money. There's a way to make money off of documentary film now. And the slow and steady result of that will be the disempowerment of the filmmaker, because the people who pay frequently, if it's corporate money, want more control. And we have to keep our eyes on that, by the way. That's something that is an emerging phenomenon as long-form journalism declines and the feature film in theaters declines. The documentary, people wonder now, why am I seeing so many documentaries and why do I like them so much when I never liked them before? Well, because it's a great form that it scratches the itch that the feature film and the long form magazine article used to scratch, and those things are becoming extinct. The documentary is a really powerful form of storytelling. I saw it myself. I actually experienced this in real life, and it's rare because a lot of long form journalists don't become documentary filmmakers. But I wrote for Vanity Fair magazine, I wrote long articles that got as much attention as you could possibly get for an 8,000 word magazine article. Making a tiny independent film, the impact of that tiny independent film was exponentially greater than an 8,000, 10,000 word article in the most high profile magazine in the United States. So that's how powerful film is. And that's how powerful and influential nonfiction filmmaking is. And I couldn't be more thrilled that it's more prevalent now and more popular. But that comes with a different set of considerations and dangers.
Two quick questions, because both of us are busy guys. Number one, if I understand correctly, in Australia, voting is compulsory. Do you think that voting should be compulsory in the United States?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Australian ballot. I mean, it would just solve a lot of problems, I think. It would force civic engagement. And I think that, I mean, the biggest voting bloc is non-voters. Again, you know, not to get too civics lessony on everyone, but, you know, in the United States, the people are sovereign. When I was editing Gore Vidal, who was such a great writer and thinker on The Nation and what he called the American Empire, not correctly, you know, he would go on about we the people. And I remember Graydon Carter, who's the editor of Vanity Fair, was like, can you get him to stop doing that we the people thing? It's so hackneyed. But at the time, I kind of agreed. I mean, you know, Gore spoke as sort of like President Vidal. But now I think, no, you should have done more of it, because the people are sovereign. You know, this is not a autocracy yet or a dictatorship yet. And the only reason for that is that the people are sovereign. We don't have a king or a dictator. The president presides and shares power with the other two houses. So people should vote, because that's how you
feel that if they're so influenced and can be manipulated by all these forces that are not history and knowledge, that they could vote for something really horrendous?
They absolutely could. But then, Fred, I will know, you will know, we will know what the people really want. And then I will, you know, be securing my EU passport somehow. And we'll find a place to go if that's really what people want. But I fear and suspect, and I've read enough analysis of polling, that they don't really want that. And they are being hornswoggled and bamboozled by snake oil salespeople. And we have a chief snake oil salesman in the form of Trump. And that's partially why we're here, in large part. So that would be my suspicion.
Second question, you and I could, well, frankly, we could spend another 2 hours doing this and not get boring, at least not to each other. But another musical selection you picked that I adore is the Fellini album, music by Nino Rota, who I had the honor and pleasure of knowing. And I knew Fellini quite well, worked with him a lot. So just everyone go hear that. He's Italian, obviously, these are all Italians. Your first film, I think your first film, and a great film, is about the designer Valentino. And I want to say parenthetically, we didn't even talk about my favorite film of yours, which is Jane Jacobs. But that's for another time, because we didn't get into the whole question of urban design and all of that. Jean Nouvel, about whom you've done a film, The Great Architect. So that would be for another time. But Valentino, the film, made a huge splash, and it's a wonderful film. And that was your first film, yes?
Yes, yes.
How did you do that? Because it's great.
I just did it. I'm asked, I like to talk to classes a lot, and that's always the question, which is how do I become a director? Or how do I become, or how did you become? And the answer is I just did it, which might not be very satisfying, but I think it's an important answer for students to hear, or anyone who wants to do something major, which is if you think you have a good idea, you've got to get the energy together. If you don't have it naturally, or just find it, and do it. And figure out how to do it, and don't let people tell you it's a bad idea. Many people told me it was a bad idea to make that movie. Many people told me that from all walks of life. And I don't know. I'm pretty determined. So it was. I had wanted to do it for a long time, and I know my movies. I knew my long form journalism, and I knew my skill set, and I was looking for a subject, basically, and subject matter. I needed the subject matter. I needed the access to do it, and the money was hard, but it wasn't the hardest part. And once you have the energy and the idea, and then you have the financing, if you're not lazy or on drugs or whatever is going to impede you, maybe you're not lazy and on drugs, and that works for you, then I think you just keep going. Now, will you get recognized for it? I do believe, I interviewed Jason Epstein in the Jane Jacobs movie, who was one of the great book editors, publishers and book editors. He was Jane Jacobs's editor, actually. He just died this year, Jason. And we were talking about the internet and the decline of print in publishing. And he said, we were off camera at the time. He said, there is no, and there will never be a masterpiece that's unacknowledged. He said that it is inevitable that it will be found and eventually, in time, acknowledged. So in the kind of tighter time frame, if you do something, I think this is an impediment to a lot of people want to make major works that are daunting, is that, well, what if I do it and no one notices? What if it's good and no one gets it? And, well, you know what, that happens a lot. But eventually I really do think, and I've seen this, not so much of my own work, which is my film making's 10 years old, 11 maybe at this point. I mean, I've seen things get popular, like go up and down a little, but this is a very short period. But I've seen it with because I'm such a film buff, you would know about it with music. And in painting, Caravaggio is a great example of that, I think. But the novels that were unacknowledged at the time, I mean, one that comes to mind is Confederacy of Dunces, which actually people don't like it as much in this period, but people found it. It was an unknown thing. Citizen Kane's a great example in filmmaking. It kind of flopped and didn't get a lot of attention at the time, and now it's the number one. And there'll always be the Godfathers, which were hailed when you have
and La Dolce Vita.
Oh, I forgot about that.
That's actually the best film ever made.
Yeah, no, that's the top of my list. Yeah. But I think that you shouldn't have that fear. I think when you do something good, that eventually you will find an audience, and it tends to scale up. And I'm generally pessimistic about a lot of things, politics being one of them, but I'm full of hope about the creative process and people who want to do it and just figure it out, which is really what you have to do. And you have to have that determination. And that's how I did it. I just sort of figured it out. I didn't go to film school, really. I mean, I was a film major in college, but I didn't really go to film school. I didn't go to journalism school either. I'm not a big
I was a history major because I knew that whether I went into opera or journalism, I needed to know history. So That's what I studied. I realized, Matt, that number one, that you and I could do this for another 2 hours. Maybe we will somewhere. I'd love to do it in Los Angeles, on your home turf. And we never even spoke about New York much. And it's interesting because you've lived here and I've worked a lot in LA, and the towns are described as being opposing and different. To me, they're not, actually.
Oh, I think they're very much congruent.
Yes,
they're not
I
equal,
agree.
they're congruent.
I agree. I realized that this recent period on Fred Plotkin on Fridays has been sort of a mini festival of groundbreaking, talented, not easy to define, but fascinating figures. I had David Devan, who is the head of Opera Philadelphia, who has remade opera in Philadelphia, not only. I had Randall Scotting, who is a countertenor who's broken all kinds of barriers. I've had Matt Tyrnauer today, and audiences have had the pleasure of learning about him, and I have had the pleasure of visiting with you. And next week, I don't ever announce my next guest, but I'm doing it this time. I have the countertenor Anthony Roth Costanzo, filmmaker, entrepreneur, social activist, groundbreaker. And I mention Anthony in part because people who listen to Adagio or subscribe to it can watch him tonight at 7:30 Eastern doing Handel's Amadigi di Gaula live with Boston Baroque. And it will be on 7:30 in New York, so 4:30 in LA, and late at night in Europe, but it will be available for viewing until May 22nd. And so Anthony, I don't know if you've ever met or worked with Anthony. You probably have worked with Justin Vivian Bond, who has worked with Anthony, and quite a figure in his own right, the way you are, Matt. And I genuinely thank you for this time. And you always teach me. And to put it in the simplest terms, what do I live for? Learning. And I learned so much from you, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you, Fred. I've learned a lot from you over the years too. And I found one of your food books about Italy. I had it as, I don't know, in my early journeys to Italy, I had that in my suitcase. So it's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. See you soon, I hope.